Hey everyone, welcome to the NACB Social Equity Emerge Conference. I have a message for you from Gina Cranwinkle, the CEO of NACB.
Thank you for being here today. Thank you for caring enough about social equity to engage in our conversation today. When we chose the topic for this conference, for liberty and justice for all, we had the principles that founded this nation in mind. I believe all includes everyone. This is really the only way this country, as a democracy, can work. We, as a country, should be united, but we are not. The problem is we've become divided. In many communities, in many workplaces, in many of our daily interactions, the color of our skin is still the first and the last information we take in about others. It is a conscious or unconscious barrier to forming the relationships we need as individuals and as a society to be resilient and to be happy. Yes, happy. Social equity is about getting everyone to the finish line. We, as a nation, are only as strong as the most marginalized amongst us. We cannot, as a country, reach our highest potential without having all of the parts of our society function at their best. How can we include and empower everyone? How can we stop creating unnecessary burdens for each other? How can we make our individual voices heard? These are some of the questions that will get our conversations started today. At the end of the day, we are all brothers and sisters. Each and every one of us is important and valued. We are all part of this country. We are all responsible for making it better now and for the future. The NACB is offering this event today with the hopes that you can take away some of the tools and the energy to pursue this in your daily lives. We are deeply appreciative of all the support we have received in creating this event, especially Emerge Canada, who'd allowed us to use their platform to discuss these topics. We could not offer this social equity conference without the commitment of our panelists, moderators, and the Merge team, and everyone in the industry and society that raises their voices to make a change and have a more united future. Nearly 60 years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their character." Let's build on this timeless dream, both today and moving forward together. May this conference bring us a step closer to making this dream a reality. As Senator Ted Kennedy said, "We know the future will outlast all of us, but I believe that all of us will live in the future we make." Let your voice be heard for the future you want to see, one filled with equity and inclusion.
Thank you so much, Gina. Up next, we have a speaker, Saskia Fan James. Saskia works as a bike mechanic at Broadway Bicycle in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Currently, the only Black woman working at a cooperative bike shop in the entire state of Massachusetts. Saskia also works at Massachusetts Recreational Consumer Council, a BIPOC-founded and consumer advocacy and educational nonprofit that facilitates economic and social justice while functioning as a cooperative. as a lobbyist and board member. Working as a lobbyist for social equity brings her into another rarity, as she stands to be the only Black woman working as a lobbyist fighting for social equity in the cannabis industry in Massachusetts. Saskia's experience with practicing intersectionality and working in cooperatives brings an alternative outlook into the cannabis industry and the issues facing it today. If you would like to support her work through Massachusetts Recreational Consumer Council, please become a member and join the movement today. All right, I'll let you guys have it now.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending upon where you guys are at. I'm really excited to be speaking with you guys today, and more importantly, to have this conversation with you and introduce you to this phenomenal panel of people that we have with us today. The first person I want to introduce you to is Kelly Perez. Kelly is the president and co-founder of Cannabis Doing Good, the co-executive director of the Cannabis Impact Fund, and the CEO co-founder of Kind Colorado. Trademark Cannabis Social Responsibility puts into action the purpose-driven cannabis partnerships to support equity, justice, positive impact plan, and environmental sustainability. CSR helps to shift the cannabis narrative from the war on drugs to a cultural sea change where opportunities are racially equitable and policy is just communities benefit, and cannabis is a circular economic practice. If you would like to learn more, please go to www.cannabisimpactfund.org. My second person I would love to introduce you to is Heather Penzel. Heather is a teen coach and spiritual companion. And Heather uses they, them, or she, her terms and is not an expert in equity and inclusion. Heather is, however, committed to being a lifelong learner and dismantling the constructs of white privilege, which were and are a part of the fabric of their culture of origin. Heather has worked for 20 years in education and human services, bearing witness to the effects of capitalism and racism on young Indigenous, Black and Brown young people, both at home and abroad. Heather believes it's the job of white identified people to educate themselves and commit themselves to anti-racist action. And if you would like to learn more, please go to www.withinwithoutholism.com. And my third person I'm really excited to present to you is Ernest Toney. Ernest is the founder of BIPOC Can, a company that aims to make the legal cannabis industry more accessible and profitable for BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the Americas. Prior to BIPOC Can, he managed global marketing initiatives for Marijuana Business Daily, where he led campaigns to expand the company's global readership, marketing partnerships, and event registrations for the MG BizCon suite of business conferences in 3 continents. And if you would like to learn more, please go to www.bipoccan.com. So good day, everybody. How are you guys doing today? I'm really excited and have a lot of questions, but let's just get you guys to say hello to the audience for a second so they know you're there.
Hello, so pleased to be here, Saskia, Heather, Ernest. Thank you, Gina. This used to be really lonely work. I've been around a little while, and it's so lovely to be working with others who are holding this up. So thank you.
Thank you for hanging in there with us. Thank you. Thank you for your dedication. Ernest and Heather, you guys want to jump in and say hello?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. I want to say thanks to the NACB and Megan and Gina. Excited to kick off this conversation with you all. It's a very important topic, and cool to see we have a whole day dedicated for it.
Atamarie, I'm joining you from Wellington, New Zealand. I'm originally from Minnesota, from the Minneapolis area. It is officially after 6 a.m., so I feel like I've had a little time to get going, get the coffee processed. I'm feeling a little more energetic now. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here with the 3 of you. Yeah, I feel really fortunate, and I'm excited to hear what you guys have for us today.
Nice. Thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to dip in. And one of the things we're going to go over terms, and hopefully you guys have a list of terms in front of you with definitions that we will be using as a guideline. And one of the first things we just want to jump into is identifying the difference between equity and equality. Kelly, if you want to go first and just trying to flesh that out, and Ernest and Heather, if you just want to jump in and share your perspectives. And just give examples, if you could, on those two that you've seen out here in cannabis or outside.
Okay, I'm going to try not to professor you because I professor sometimes. But I love that you're starting with some baseline information because people do get really confused. Equality is where we're trying to head, right? That's what Gina was talking about. That's Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. Equity is how we get there because everyone doesn't start from the same starting place. Like you hear people say things like, a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, not if someone had a stick, someone doesn't know how to swim, someone had a yacht, and someone had a sailboat, right? So to create equity, what you would want to do is make sure that everyone had what they needed to move towards equality. So you'd want to make sure that person with a stick had a better flotation device. And maybe a yacht isn't even necessary, right? So it's thinking about equality is, right, our souls, who we are all equal. But we have systems in place that have prevented us from starting from the same starting place. Things like redlining, things like the GI Bill that benefited soldiers when they came back from serving, but who was not available to Indigenous folks, Latinos who were serving, or Black Americans. So understanding that we have systems in place that have prevented equitable access on the dream, on the path to equity. And I hope that's enough if y'all want to join in.
Thank you. Ernest and Heather, if you want to give us, if you want to expound upon that more, and also if you have like any examples that you've ever seen, like differentiating those two so people can have like, just visualize it for an example for themselves.
Sure. I mean, one of my nieces was born with cerebral palsy and a developmental delay. And so a really positive example of equity was as she was going through elementary and up through high school, she was provided with a lot of supports because she ambulates by wheelchair. Her physical functions are limited. She needed more supports. She needed a paraprofessional to be in some of her classrooms with her to be able to process information. She had an individualized education plan so that she could graduate with her peers. And so for her, she needed those extra supports in order to thrive, in order to be successful in the classroom, right? So not all of her peers got those same supports because they didn't necessarily need those supports to be successful. And her community, her school saw her as beneficial with her differences, with the unique situation that she was living out, to be a part of that community so that not only could she learn from everyone else, but they could also learn from her and her experiences. So that for me is something I'm super grateful for.
So one of the things I heard when you say that, just to flesh it out, was just that somebody had a disability, and this school, this organization, was able to provide. They wanted this person. They wanted this person to succeed to their highest potential. They believed in that person, and they developed the tools necessary so that this person could be included in all of the programs that the school provided, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And if my niece would have been born 50 years earlier, she might have actually ended up isolated in a kind of home for people with disabilities. She wouldn't have been included in the community. She wouldn't have had those supports. And in fact, she probably, I am not sure most people would have believed that she could be a productive, beneficial part of the community. So, I mean, that's again, it's like, I'm real glad that she was born in the 90s, because she did have access to some of those supports that have been developed over time.
Thank you. Thank you. Ernest, would you like to hop in and share a little bit?
Yeah, I think those are great examples. And I think you both nailed it so far. focus on the equity piece here just for a minute, because one of the, well, actually, I'll give an example, right? A lot of times, and I'll give an example about like my hometown, for example. I grew up in a small place in rural Virginia. There's like a lot of racial history there. About 20 minutes away from where the Civil War ended. So you had a lot of historical processes that were directly, affecting the way that people interacted, the way they lived, their opportunities, et cetera. So about 70 years ago in our hometown, there was like a student walkout because you had basically like the students, the Black students that went to public schools, were protesting. They had vastly inferior, I guess like they protested that the educational environment was vastly inferior to that of the white students, and that actually prompted the Supreme Court decisions for Brown versus Board of Education. Some of the protests and I think the disparities that were brought up made like my hometown one of the 5 cases that was cited in that. So you fast forward a few years and you have a situation where now you have the law of the land requiring people to integrate in public schools. And, my hometown was one that said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to defund schools. And we essentially closed those schools for 5 years, meaning that, if you were a Black person or, a poor white person, there was no opportunity for you to get education. So if you think about how you can have policies in place, whether it's local or national, that remove barriers, in this case, access to education, when a few years later, when the public school systems have been restored, you have folks who are starting their education at a different level. They're behind. So when you can say, all right, well, in order for you to advance and get this job opportunity, you have to have a certain level of education or degree, this or that. You can see like a real practical way that a system has prevented those folks from getting the basic education and requirements to access those opportunities. Yeah. So that's like a real example of equity. Inequities like within a place that is very personal and familiar with me. So you can work towards creating a more equitable system by creating additional opportunities for those folks in those communities that were deprived from the same type of access. So I saw that play out just through like special programs that were, designed to accelerate like those communities that did not have access to education. So that's one example, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about others like within like the cannabis space.
I love how you framed it that way, Ernest, because that's exactly what we're talking about in social equity, right? That it's the policy that is meant to remove the barriers that have been put in place by the weaponization and anti-Blackness of cannabis, frankly. But everybody doesn't understand why we're doing it. And so everyone's not buying it. They're not recognizing that it's to remove systemic barriers that were created. And policy is one lever for change, but we also have others. So I love how you framed it.
Thank you, guys. I just want to go over some more terms that we're going to be discussing today. And we're going to be talking about like, what do these words mean? But first, I just want to go over like actual definitions. So hopefully all of you guys have received a sheet, and these have a sheet of terminologies from the Creative Strategies for Change. One of the first words I'm just going to give you the definition for is diversity. So we're all on the same page in understanding these words being used. Diversity is known as the numerous variants of identity, skill, appearances, abilities, and other characteristics of any group. The level of difference represented within any group. So that's one term that we're going to use today. A second term that we're going to talk about today is inclusion. Inclusion is defined as a set of community values which suggests that people of all backgrounds, identities, abilities, perspectives, and beliefs should have an equal opportunity to belong, achieve, and contribute to their communities. To be truly inclusive requires people to value, respect, and accept diversity, as well as utilizing an equity lens or power analysis. And then a third term I really am excited to share with you guys today is intersectionality. And intersectionality is defined as the intersections of systems of oppression, an analysis of how systems of oppression relate and mutually reinforce each other. People's realities may be shaped by the intersection of social identities, simultaneously benefiting some systems of oppression and being harmed by others. This term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, referencing gender and race. So I just want to have like a little bit of a discussion with you guys on these terms. I feel like they need to be just explained a little bit more and given like more nuance and examples. Like, what does diversity mean to you, and what's a great example of it out here? What's a great example of inclusion? But we can start with just diversity. Kelly, I have you here if you would like to start first, and then and everybody else can jump in.
Sure. And just like connecting it to cannabis, right? Because you hear a lot of folks talking about diversity, equity, inclusion right now because of the racial reckoning that's happened in the United States. And frankly, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, are the terms that white people are often comfortable saying because race is an uncomfortable thing to say. And Heather, you should weigh in here because you're an activated anti-racist white person. And that needs to be demonstrated. Like, what does that look like? You can survive these conversations. A lot of folks are super nervous about it. They've been, instructed and guided to not see race, to not talk about it. And that prevents us from having real conversations about diversity when it's time to have them. So a company jumping right to let's do a diversity, equity, inclusion initiative, that their hearts are in the right place. But if they haven't done thoughts about a power analysis, like why don't we have any people of color here? And then found it into cannabis. We're not talking about blanket diversity. We're actually talking about anti-Black racism and how cannabis was weaponized and prevented, jailed still across the country, and people were prevented from being able to participate in this industry. So we've got to talk about diversity as it relates to the context of the war on drugs, the context, so that when we're talking about how do we diversify our company, like a People's Dispensary or a Simply Pure, or some of the companies I can think of off the top of my head that are racially diverse, well, they certainly don't need DEI programs, right? It's companies that are thinking about how do we become more diverse. And then the intersectional piece, of course, you're Black and you're gay or non-gender conforming, that is, you're going to even have more barriers. We are building this sector as we go. So to look at these things and to recognize how do they apply to us, given the context of where we came from, the problematic start of cannabis, what is it that we want to do to create an industry that is the best out there? There's no industry that's nailing all these things.
No.
There's also not one that's looking at it, examining and having these conversations regularly, because we clearly want to take this story that's been kind of crappy so far and turn it into something that includes all the gifts that we would bring to the table.
Exciting times. Ernest, do you want to jump in and share a little bit with us on how you've seen or what diversity means for you, and inclusion and intersectionality?
Yeah, I think the way that Kelly described that was spot on. I think so, especially this year, we just saw a ton of social unrest, and I think within the cannabis industry, we started to see executives, media entities, et cetera, try to put messages out there saying that, hey, we stand in solidarity. We want to work towards having like a more inclusive, diverse environment. So, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can approach that. When I think of diversity, I think of it as, the collective, trying to make sure that you have a wide range of perspectives, viewpoints, values, people, represented. And, I think if we're going to talk about some of the exact things that like companies can do, I think you have to take a look at not only the makeup of your staff, sort of how those folks are positioned. Like, do you only have people of a certain, gender or racial or ethnic background, like within certain positions, like on the front lines, for example? Or so, or are you being intentional about making sure that you have that varied, those varied perspectives throughout the entire, structure, from the C-level all the way down to, who you do your business with, vendors, suppliers. I think one thing that companies can do that are really trying to figure out how to tackle this problem is to take, take a holistic view as to like the way that they do business, you know? So it's not just about who you employ, but it's who you work with, how are decisions made. Um, so I think those are some good starting points. You know, a lot of times you should also be taking a look at the messages that you put out there, you know, in your marketing, your communications, your website, you know, the messages that you're putting out to the public. Uh, if you have folks that come from varied perspectives, then you can probably be more critical and, you know, essentially catch, you know, I think you can have a better job of like looking at the optics of how your company, how your brand is being viewed. And I think it's going to be important to, that's just, we can elaborate on that in a second, but I think that's why it's important for you to have varied people like and perspectives, you know, built into your operation.
Thank you, Ernest. Heather, do you have any words on this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I grew up in suburban Minnesota, in a place that's really known for being nice and also known for being really white. So when I was growing up, you know, when I hear Ernest's story about the town that he grew up in, that hearing that story for me as a young person would reinforce a lot of attitudes and ideas that I had, that racism was something that happened somewhere else. It happened in the American South. It happened in South Africa. And I was, you know, and of course, being a nice white Minnesotan with not surrounded by diversity, I was like, oof, well, at least I'm not like that. Right. And as I grew up, as people started to be more honest about the history of Minnesota, you know, I realized, oh, I didn't grow up necessarily in Minnesota. I grew up on Dakota land. I grew up in a place that we whitewashed our history so we could forget about the mass genocide and the stealing of lands. You know, Minnesota was the home of the largest execution of Indigenous Americans. And it, you know, the order for the execution was given by President Lincoln. So for me as a white person, again, President Lincoln, we don't want to think bad things about that person in history, right? But we can start to realize that even our best efforts as white people sometimes fall drastically short. And in fact, you know, just because we're not aware of our privilege and our bias doesn't make us innocent of those things. So for me, you know, growing up in a predominantly white community, I've had to realize, okay, I'm still benefiting from those systems, from that history. And so, and also as a queer person, where that's my personal example of intersectionality. I don't have to come out on a daily basis, right? I can choose whether I'm going to identify in public as a non-binary person, as a person who's somewhere on the LGBTQI plus spectrum, right? But I look around at my friends and my neighbors, particularly people of color, and that privilege isn't available, right? We do make judgments based on site value a lot of times, right? So that has been part of my learning process about diversity, about intersectionality, that I have to take an active role, especially if I find myself, I've lived in two of the whitest cities in the United States, Minneapolis and Portland, Oregon. So in order for me to be anti-racist, I need to put myself out there. I need to be willing to let go of my privilege so that other voices can be heard and can be amplified. I have to go out of my comfort zone to take risks and, you know, be parts of conversations where I know that I am not going to be looking good necessarily, you know, and I have to be willing to bear that because I don't, you know, and so in any case, that's been my experience of diversity, of intersectionality. and some of the realizations that I've had along the way.
Thank you so much for that.
And connecting it to cannabis, because I can't help it. I love that personal story, because that's exactly where we're often trying to get our clients to, because honestly, I had to do a lot of work around the return on investment for working on these issues, for supporting community, for having environmentally sound practices, for being actively anti-racist. And we do have to connect it to business, because that's what we're talking about. So we know that boards of directors, when they are more diverse, have better returns. We know that California has a law that requires, publicly traded companies have to have 50% women on their board. So a policy solution to try to fix a problem that the industries weren't solving for themselves. When we connect that to cannabis, if we know the data around diverse companies are more financially successful, well, why is it that we're not that way? Right. So we have to unpack that, because it isn't interpersonal. It's not that the enemy is sometimes that concept, right, Heather, and Ernest, and Saskia, of thinking of like being nice and white can often be the barrier. It's getting shame resilient and recognizing that you're not going to be the queen of the show here, because that was false and it is unnecessary. What would it look like to lift up marginalized voices? What if we recognize that it's systems that have kept people out? Because Ernest, there are so many companies that'll say, well, we want to hire a diverse audience, but we haven't been able to find them. They're hard to find. Well, yeah, they are. We live in separate places. We have very, segregated communities. The fact that the people of color on this panel, that we're all similar shade, colorism, right? Racism. Like some of us are let through the gateway where darker skinned brothers and sisters aren't, right? We have to understand that and figure out where are the people and how do we get them? How do resumes look different? What am I actually valuing, right? It's not going to be the traditional necessarily qualifications. If my aim is to create a diverse workforce, if my aim is to be an actively anti-racist company, recognizing that I'll make more money that way, frankly, that's just the way it's going, clearly. But people also don't know how to do it. And we do have to help people understand how. And it's painful for me, because I've been doing this work like 30 years. It's painful to have to walk people through, Heather, other white people. What is your stake in the game for having an anti-racist company? And if making more money is what you want to do, like, let's just talk about that, because these are actually strategies to be an employer of choice, to have more market share with your customers, to build those supply chains, Ernest, as you were saying, but recognizing that I have a role in creating that. In my sector, because the privilege of operating in cannabis, built on the backs of Black and brown and sick people, is that I'm going to carry this story forward and create, socially responsible, economically beneficial, environmentally sound sector.
I didn't mean to, but there was a word that you used, Kelly, that was really, really important, I feel like, in trying to follow along in everything that you were saying. And that word that I heard was shame resilient. I feel like, in talking about race and the uncomfortability for white people to have this conversation with everybody else, that's a very key word to try to understand, especially in the aspect of like cannabis businesses, that you may feel shameful in even having to have this conversation, and then having to approach another Black, Indigenous person of color on this subject matter. And thank you. You jumped right on in, like, why is diversity an asset? But I guess can you guys like flesh that a little bit more? And then what ways can people, white people, can deal with shame resiliency? Like, how do you actually, deal with that so that you can have these conversations so that your business is profitable and doing, like you said, it's actually making waves. In ways that because other businesses are refusing, they don't have that shame resiliency. You're stepping out and you're receiving a humongous amount of benefits as a result. And Ernest, Heather, please, everybody, if you can just jump in one at a time. Ernest, you can go first, or Kelly and Heather.
Go ahead, Ernest. Like you're doing such amazing work, like breaking out your own, to have a place where we can not have to always be capitulating to power, which in cannabis is white, right? It just is.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I don't know if I can really speak to the shame resiliency question, but I do want to comment on a point that Kelly had made. A lot of times there is that burden where, you sort of have to continue doing the education. You have to, Kelly's been doing this work for, a long time. So I can definitely speak to, the experiences that she's had to continue to try to, share the data, try to educate, try to make the point that, having a more diverse and inclusive staff uh, will actually, bring benefit to your operation. But sometimes there could be those walls that, you have that cognitive dissonance. So if someone might say, well, I haven't seen that, play out yet. So why should I believe like what you're telling me? Now, I don't know what the conversations are like that Kelly's had, but, I've worked at a lot of places like internally and know that you have to also, sort of bring what as a person of color to try to influence change, influence policies. And that's why I think it's important for you, companies to be intentional about having like diversity at all levels of their companies. Especially within decision making processes, because if you're going to say that you want to commit to being like diverse in this industry, yet you don't have anyone within leadership or management that fits that mold, then you're going to be missing some important I guess like some important ways that you can actually go about enacting that change internally, or you know um, through your service and program offerings. Kelly had mentioned something about how um, sometimes you might hear, okay, well, I don't really know where to go to find people, and um, I think so. One of the things that I've been trying to do, like through my venture, is to be very intentional about bringing people in. So there is an educational component, but with BIPOC Can, for example, is all about connecting BIPOC to the cannabis industry. So that means, in some ways, is a recruiting element. It's going out and saying, "Hey, look, there are opportunities within this space. This is a growing industry. You should be a part of it." So it's identifying people who may be interested, who may have a service, who may have a business, and then trying to figure out how those opportunities and their skill sets can support this industry. But one of the things you have to understand too is, for a lot of communities of color, we've seen cannabis being used as a tool uh, to for mass incarceration, to destroy your community, to destroy your families. So there's still a lot of fear around this plant. There's a lot of folks who, doesn't matter like how I look or what my relationship is like, I can go back to my hometown and talk to people about the opportunities here, but within cannabis, and they don't want to touch it because they've seen how cannabis has been policed and being used to destroy their family and their communities. So there's that educational component. And I think, Saskia is going to probably get to this, but I think that's why decriminalization is such an important step in some places, because if you can get to that point where you're where you alleviate the concerns about being arrested or being harassed because like a police officer smells cannabis on you, then that's a huge barrier that I think is necessary to have before you can even engage with some people within this industry.
Ernest, that was just such like a powerful, like a whole word right there, a whole word right there. Like my mind was just buzzing with like intersectionality, and there was just so many examples that you gave in there. Thinking about classism, and then thinking about trauma, thinking about race. And intersecting those, and so like and hiring practices, right? Like in senior positions. So just because you hired a Black person that had, say they were arrested for marijuana charges, and you have that person in that position, that Black person is going to have a different perspective than, say, a Black disabled person who uses cannabis for medical usages. And those are two really like completely different views that are varied, that can help your business on a senior C level. Sweet. My mind was like, I don't know about you guys, but I was totally like going there. Like I can have a whole conversation just on that.
Well, and Ernest alluded to that person, it being their job to bring the emotional burden of fighting racism, but then also be the marketing director, but maybe not necessarily have the power to make decisions, and how that's a whole second job that, many of us can't carry that load for very long. It's obscene. So that equity actually gets to its shared power and decision making, right? It isn't enough to be the token person of color on a staff and everybody turns to you. Well, what do you think about this marketing endeavor? Well, what do you think about the actively anti-racism, getting to social equity? Like, that's everybody's job. It's not the brown person, the black person, the disabled persons in the room. It's not their job. It's white people stepping up and saying, I think when I look at this policy, it's anti-black. We can't even hire the people who had experience in the industry because our law actually barred them from being able to participate. So what is it that we're going to do to craft equitable access to participate? So in my mind, social equity is criminal legal reform, changing those laws, recognizing the harm done, repairing it, creating opportunity for people who have been impacted by the war on drugs to participate in this industry that was kept from them, even knowing there are all the cultural barriers there, Ernest, so that they have to be overcome. And then whole communities paid for this, like Ernest's hometown and every redlined community across the United States was over-policed. And we have been the pipeline to fill prisons. So the prison industrial complex, Cannabis, is squarely on our shoulders. Like, these are very big things. But if you break it down, there's individual things we can do if we are brave and courageous, and we recognize that, in fact, it's also good for business. There are policy things that we can be looking at to make sure, are these policies only going to impact so that certain people can't participate? How do we remove them? Are there workforce development programs that we could put into place if we change those laws? And recognizing that if you're a cannabis brand, you have a role there. The policies that you should be supporting are not just about cannabis. They're about the drug war, because cannabis was a weapon, as Ernest said, for anti-blackness, to depower Black and brown communities, not just to benefit itself. Like, that's very deep. As a business, what do we do about that? And how, in your relationship with community, is a whole community benefiting, right? Because homelessness, the social determinants of health, public health outcomes, all of those were impacted by the drug war, all of those. So that if you're benefiting, like in Denver, we don't have gigantic demographic variance like we do in lots of communities across the country. But if your company is connected to serving homelessness prevention, food access, environment, you are in fact serving the same communities that were over policed, right? So it's a big picture, but it's also, what can I do to affect change at where I sit? I'm a bud tender. How do I affect change? Well, if your company has an effort once to be relicensed, community needs to say, we're good with that. What does that look like? What do those efforts look like? And those same efforts are ones that make employees feel connected to the company. And what if we're recognizing that justice efforts that we're supporting in community are directly connected to us, also help us get a license, also help us have a good reputation in community, also make us an employer of choice. Like, these things are hard, but the benefits are not, their money and licensing and community buy-in and policy that's working for more people. I mean, that's a pretty good payoff. And we get to do that in cannabis. It's hard, but we get to do it. Like, that's great.
Yeah. Heather, if you want to jump in, I just have another question, but if you have something you want to jump in and share with us, please do.
Go ahead with your question. I think they're covering most of the bases. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I feel like all of you guys answered this question already, but I just want to be very clear for our audience is why is social equity not a handout? Because that's one thing that I feel comes across in this industry so much. People just feel and then when I say people, specifically white people in this industry, feel like social equity is a handout. And I feel like you guys have answered it, but just to answer it real directly here, why do you feel that social equity is not a handout? Oh, I'm sorry. So Heather, I have you here, Ernest, Kelly, but Heather, I have you on my screen if you would like to answer that first, especially speaking as a white person on anti-racism, if you can speak on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, this kind of goes back to that idea of intersectionality. My liberation as a queer person has depended quite a bit on particularly Black trans women and their voices and their fight for equality, for equity, for queer and gender nonconforming people, right? So I can see that as a person who was assigned female at birth, as a queer person, like my liberation is bound up in the liberation of the whole group, of all of those people, right? And so understanding that in business, in our communities, in social services, in education, we can only go as far, kind of what Gina had mentioned in her introduction, is we are only as liberated, we are only as strong as the most marginalized among us. That's our friends, our neighbors, our families, ourselves. We are all interconnected. And the same systems that marginalize certain groups also hold those in power captive to those systems. And until we can realize that, we're not going to advance as a community, right? And that's something that we as Americans struggle with. Our culture is very individualized. It's very much based on pulling myself up by my own bootstraps, working for what I have, right? Unfortunately, as you know, we talked about the importance of equity and that not everybody is starting from the same place. In fact, some people are, because of the systems, the policies, our history, they're starting from miles behind, right? So for us as a community, for cannabis as an industry, you can only go as far as those people who have struggled the most, who have been incarcerated for minor offenses, you know, those types of things. And so that, you know, it's benefiting everyone is what I'm trying to say. So, and hopefully Kelly and Ernest can add to that.
Ernest, do you want to hop in and share on why social equity is not a handout?
Yeah, I think Heather was spot on with that, and I think we've all sort of alluded to it like over the course of the hour. You know, one thing that I want to point out is, you know, when we take a look at the way that you know, we're inching closer towards federal legalization, and you know, we have, like, even a week ago, you have 5 states that pass legislation that will will open you know, an adult use or recreational market. I think Arizona was probably the only one that had the most robust social equity provision. Some of the states, you know, either did not mention it or they will be focusing on that at some point before the market opens. But I think it's important to remember that, you know, plant is still federally illegal. So when you can see how you have folks who are, you know, in the profit centers of this industry making millions, if not billions of dollars, you know, for their companies and their states respectively. But at the same time, you have over 40,000 people who are, you know, incarcerated for cannabis possession and use for the same federally illegal plant. I think that's why it's important to really acknowledge that social equity programs need to be included and when new states, when new markets, you know, emerge. Because I mean, if you just look at it from a from sheer like fairness, I mean, it just doesn't make sense, you know, that you can have folks who are making all of this money off of the same thing that's putting people behind bars, like literally selling the same amount of quantity of a plant, and one person we know is like might, you know, be in jail for, you know, decades, if not their entire life, for the same quantity of plant that person over here is making, you know, significant, like they're making income and millions of dollars off of. Like, you have to have provisions that are going to address those disparities. So, I mean, I don't think it's a handout at all. Like, you need to, it's really like acknowledging the history and acknowledging that, um, there have been barriers that have kept people behind bars, but also out of this industry. So if you can do a little something to try to level that playing field, the way that Kelly said, you have these communities that have, and these folks that are coming from these places that are, they may want to get into this industry. They may want to use their experiences and their skill sets. They want to also have a life and help others and make a living off of it. But they're so far behind because of the way that it's been, policed, et cetera. So I know I went on another tangent, but that's just my thoughts there. I think we need it.
Beautiful.
And it's a lever for change, right? Social equity programs absolutely need to be included in policy, but they're not sufficient, right? We can't name a single one of them that's working well, because people are still actively racist, because systems are still in place to prevent equitable access. So we have to recognize that the policy lever is one lever and needs to be continuously worked on. I mean, in Colorado, we had no social equity in our legislation at all, and it's taken 5 years to get a definition, to create an incubator program, to have an accelerator program, and those are programs. Will people be able to go around them? Absolutely. Do they still need to be in place so that there are at least access points and some system of accountability? Absolutely. But we also need business people and brands to recognize that if you're a white business owner, you don't think a social equity program applies to you. Well, if you don't try to go around it, that's great. That would be helpful. If you also recognize, what are the things that I can do as a business owner, as as someone who's acquiring product and services from others, how am I behaving equitably and just? Because we can get carried away thinking that policy is the only place. Business, there are 38,000 cannabis businesses, something like that, or 17,000. I mean, crazy amounts. If each of them were recognizing that I have a role, then the policy would not even necessarily be necessary. And I'm a policy person. I support policy. We also need engaged consumers who are educated around the historical framework of cannabis, and that are beginning as problematic, and shop Black, shop Indigenous, shop Latino. Make sure that you're using your dollars in a way that supports your values. And we're going to see much, much more of that. That's the racial reckoning needs places that it can respond. I know a Black-owned cannabis business whose business is up like hundreds of percentage points since George Floyd's killing. I mean, it sucks. We all know how horrible that is. At the same time, you see customers trying to do the right thing, and they had to search to find Simply Pure. If companies, BIPOC companies, women-owned companies were out front leading with this, consumers would come. And there are lots of things that you can't talk about. Consumers are only shopping by price right now. But if they shop by things that they care about, like anti-racism, like environmental sustainability and benefiting community, I think we'll see a lot of power there. I do have to do a quick shout out for the Cannabis Impact Fund that NACB was kind enough to include. Part of our work at Cannabis Doing Good is, how do we make the right thing the easy thing? Because we know all these things are hard. You might be a chemist in your basement working in cannabis. How are you supposed to step up and become a racially active individual? Well, the Cannabis Impact Fund is an easy way to do that, because you can, for the first time, cannabis is connected to the movement for Black Lives. We're supporting Black Futures Lab, Color of Change, the Bail Project, which are out there doing work for the Black community. We're supporting Hood Incubator, Minorities for Medical Marijuana, and the Minority Cannabis Business Association, because these are our own homegrown cannabis organizations working for racial justice at the start. So you can find a way to get in on this, and to recognize, if you're a white person like Heather, being actively anti-racist and working in this space, there's so much opportunity for you, and you get to do it. You get to take these, the state of where we're in right now, and do something. I mean, I'm so grateful to get to do something, and to get to do something with all of you.
Thank you so much. We just have, go ahead, Ernest. We just have a few minutes, so I just want to wrap up, but please share your final thoughts with us. I could go on. I had like a whole nother word and everything, but I don't have time, and I'm so mad, but go ahead, Ernest.
Gotcha. Real quick, one thing that Kelly said is that social equity programs are just one of the levers. So I think that's important. It does not always you don't have to always relate rely on policy to be the change. It's important, of course, but there are direct actions that you can take. So, you know, like I said earlier, like looking about who you hire, who you do your business with, who you recruit, how you can contribute. Like I'm going to give to the Cannabis Impact Fund too, because I align with their values, and the work that Kelly is doing is awesome. So, you know, like we can all work together to, you know, collaborate. I'll give one number that I think is um, just to illustrate, I think, how massive this is, right? You know, last year when I was working at MJ Biz, you know, we, you know, put on the annual conference in Vegas, and I think we had over 30,000 people show up from probably 80 countries. That's a lot. Everybody talks about how huge that event is and how valuable it is for the industry. And if you think about that and then contrast it with the fact that there are over 40,000 people behind bars, more people who are on that show floor for this exact same thing. Like if you could find ways to make this industry more equitable, work with and most of the people behind bars are, you know, people of color. So if you had ways for those folks to be part of the legal industry, I mean, think about how much value that brings to your business from consumers, from potential vendors who you can work with. So I think this is an issue that affects everybody, regardless of whether or not you believe it. Like we need to we need to work together to like make some change. So
Yes, and as a consumer, let me tell you, in Massachusetts, we've been suffering. I've not been hiring people that have been arrested for marijuana charges and that are growers. And our weed sucks, you guys, in this state. It is horrible. It absolutely sucks. So the social equity program is not working, and our growers are holding back as a result. They won't work with the corporations because the corporations are greedy and they're not providing equity to them. So that's another, your product is going to suck. That can be an end result. I just want to point that out here since we're all here for the plant and its amazing ability. Make sure you work with the people that actually created this industry first. Is there any final words that you guys would like to share? Otherwise, I believe we have like one more minute and then we have to go for today. And
I just wanted to encourage all the good white people who showed up for this conference. I just want to give a reminder that inaction is the same, complacency is the same as racism. It is racism, doing nothing. So please find the Kellys and the Ernests in your community and ask what you can do to take the burden off of their shoulders. Be active, be part of the solution.
And have some of your own ideas, because we've been carrying this for a long time. And you don't need to be perfect. Perfect is a piece of white supremacy. It's not important. You just have to be resilient, keep trying, humble, and motivated, and stick with it.
Yeah, it's scary, but do it. It's worth it.
Thank you, you guys. Those are awesome tidbits for people to walk away with. I really appreciate the time that you've taken to have with me and to have with all of us today. Thank you for all the work that you're doing to build our country, to build lives, to build our communities, to build this industry so that it is more equitable, it's more inclusive, and it's really honoring the cannabis plant. You know, the cannabis plant gives so much. And I appreciate all of the work that you have been doing tirelessly to match the spirit of the plant. Thank you, everybody, for coming here today. And we hope you've taken away a huge learning lesson, several of them. And we look forward to seeing you out there doing the righteous work and joining us as well. Have a beautiful day, everybody. Bye.